somewhere in the annals of popular science, filed presumably between Why Toast Always Lands Butter Side Down and things that are almost but not quite entirely unlike common sense, there exists a notion called the butterfly effect. Now, the theory holds that something as trivial as a wing beat of a single butterfly can, through a long and improbable chain of cause and consequence, eventually result in a hurricane, a war, or a mildly regrettable haircut on the other side of the planet. Now, it's a theory much beloved by physicists, mathematicians, and people who prefer to blame their own failings on almost anyone and everyone else. If the theory is correct, it raises an obvious and pressing question that mainstream science has, so far, failed to adequately address. What would the world look like if nobody had ever collected a butterfly? Would the great wars of the 20th century simply not have happened? Would humanity have arrived, blinking and peaceful, into a golden age of cooperation and mutual understanding? Would the nice young man on the customer support line finally, truly, in his heart, believe that your call is important to him? We'll never know. Butterfly collecting, regrettably, persisted. What we do know is that some people believe fervently in the butterfly effect, while others regard it as a load of over-engineered nonsense dressed up in a lab coat. But today's story will do very little to settle that argument, except to say it doesn't involve a butterfly. It involves an undertaker. A tad paranoid, and by most accounts, he was the sort of man who, upon noticing his funeral business quietly drying up, did not simply assume bad luck, but instead became quietly and thoroughly convinced that a local telephone operator was intercepting his calls and steering the recently bereaved toward his rival across town. This suspicion, whether or not it was ever remotely true, would prove to have consequences roughly equivalent to a hurricane. Because rather than simply complaining about it, as any reasonable, not even remotely paranoid person might, our undertaker decided instead to invent a machine that would remove human beings from the mechanics of placing telephone calls altogether. And in so doing, he didn't just solve his own problem, he accidentally set off the chain reaction that became the modern telecommunications revolution, which, several decades and several billion phone calls later, is still very much underway. So, no butterflies, just one deeply suspicious man, a great deal of institutional overreaction, and a straight pen. The story starts with a man, and at the time of this story, an undertaker by trade. Almon Strowger was an older gentleman by the boring natural flow of the time-space continuum. However, he hadn't always been old, and in his younger days he had started his adult life as a school teacher in his hometown of Penfield, New York. When the American Civil War came along, Almon ran off to enlist and exchange the chaos of the classroom for the chaos of the battlefield, where there was an ever so slightly smaller chance of serious injury or blood loss. But by the end of 1864, he had risen through the ranks to sergeant and eventually second lieutenant before he was wounded and discharged from the army. Now, life in general has a way of changing people, and war has a tendency of changing them far faster and more thoroughly than anything else. Undoubtedly, the Almon Strowger that left Penfield was a very different man from the one that came back from war. He returned to teaching for a while, but he eventually traded the loud hurly-burly of the classroom for the dead silence of being an undertaker in Kansas, and ultimately he settled down in Kansas City, Missouri, which isn't exactly in Kansas per se, but since the only people who can tell the difference are either cartographers or people who actually lived there, we can, for all practical purposes, just say he was in Kansas. Now, business was good. In fact, folks were dying to work with him. However, things change, and after a while, business seemed to dry up. And for lack of a better term, business was dead. Almon could not for the life of him figure out how or why he was losing business. Folks he knew and had worked with seemed to be taking their business to his rival across town. Now, Almon knew there had to be something to this, but he was at a loss to explain what it might be. Then, he read about the funeral of one of his friends in the newspaper. His friend, the newspaper. Now, how was it possible that he had no idea that somebody he was close to had died, and, according to the paper, the funeral had been handled by Almon's competitor across town? Almon was thunderstruck. Almon was surprised. More than anything else, Almon was freaking angry. If this was not bona fide, verified, in all other ways, fide proof that something fishy was going on, then what else could it possibly be? Shortly afterward, Almon learned that the wife of his chief competitor, A, had a job, and B, that the job was as a switchboard operator. And that was the piece Almon was missing. It all made sense to him now, in the way that one or two random bits of information might sort of point in the same general direction, which is more than enough for somebody already susceptible to conspiracy theories and extreme suspicion. Now, Almon just knew in his heart of hearts that this lone operator, somehow, out of dozens of operators working at the local phone company, was intercepting business calls intended for him and was instead routing them to his competitor, which in this case would keep it all in the family, so to speak. To understand what comes next, it's probably necessary for a little background as to why the operators were there in the first place. Now, the original telephone was basically a direct line. Literally a direct physical pair of wires from one phone to another. And if you only wanted to talk to the same party and never ever call anyone else, that's fine. That's enough. But if you or the other party would ever want to call any other folks, then that simple, straightforward system was not going to work. In the same way that cardboard eating utensils never quite took off with the picnicker crowd, or how science documentaries never quite seemed to thrive in prime time. So the solution, up to Strowger's time, was that everyone that had a phone, and they were fairly rare in the 1880s, would have their phone line running to the switchboard at the phone company. Now, when they picked up their receiver, a light came on at the switchboard, and the operator would then connect the caller to the operator's phone, and there'd be a brief exchange as to who the caller wanted to ultimately reach, and oftentimes how the weather was on the other end of the line, and maybe a little gossip on shared friends and family. The operator would then unplug their phone from the caller and then use a patch cable to plug the caller's line to the line of the other party. As the number of telephone subscribers grew, the complexity of the system grew exponentially, and the need for telephone operators, almost all of whom were women, grew dramatically. Now, if you wanted to call somebody outside your local area, the whole mess got even messier, as the local phone company office would need to patch your call to another local phone company office, and then one of those operators would patch the call through to the intended party. Now, this is why it could take half an hour or more just to set up a phone call from coast to coast, and why the cost of making such a call was ridiculously high, which is a story for another time. However, this is probably a likely reason why telegrams remained a popular way to communicate for decades after the introduction of the telephone. But the point of all of that was that the human operator was a bit that made the whole thing work, and if that human happened to have an agenda or ulterior motive or just didn't like you, then the system could be manipulated to the benefit or detriment of one party or another, and that's exactly what Almon thought was going on here. And that's why he worked so hard to come up with a way to remove the operator entirely. Now, to be clear, Almon was no Thomas Edison. For that matter, the historical Thomas Edison is not really the same guy that we all know or think we know. However, that is also a story for another time. But Almon had a rough idea in his head of what he wanted to make, and so he sat at his kitchen table and he rigged together a very primitive prototype out of a collar box and some straight pins. Now, if you have no idea what a collar box is, or was, it was exactly as the name implies. It was a box that held collars. Not pet collars, but shirt collars. And yes, at one time the collars were separate from the shirts, and that is yet another delightful rabbit hole for another time. But the point is that this thing was not quite fit for industrial use, but it did work, and it proved the concept was feasible. In fact, it was more than feasible, it was potentially practical. Almon was wise enough to know that to make all of this happen in a relevant and potentially profitable way, he would need the help of some folks with deeper technical and business knowledge than he had. So, he reached out to his brother Arnold and his nephew William, as well as a few others, and they refined his prototype electric switch, and from there they applied for and received a patent, and then founded the Strowger Automatic Telephone Exchange Company in 1891. Now, Almon's company set up an exchange in LaPorte, Indiana in 1892, and they advertised their girl-less, cussless, out-of-orderless, weightless telephone. And there it is. With Almon's automated switching, there was no longer a need for a human operator. And that was kind of a shame, actually. In 1890s society, as a rule, women were discouraged and disparaged from joining the workforce, and the number of quasi-acceptable professions open to women were extremely limited. One man's anger and desire for justice, or even revenge, wound up removing an entire industry from the reach of potential women employees. Now, one could argue it set back the women's suffrage movement, while one could equally argue that it was one more slight and injustice that added fuel to the fire that eventually won women the right to participate in our society politically and economically. Phones on Almon's system used a small set of keys to punch in the desired number. A few years later, the company patented a finger wheel dial to replace the 4-button design, and that became the standard for phones around the globe for almost a century. It looked like fate was looking kindly on Almon. However, fate can be fickle. Based on the overwhelming success of the design and how it worked for almost a century, it would be logical and even reasonable to assume that old Almon became filthy rich and hung out at big fancy soirees like the likes of other big and financially successful inventors, such as Alexander Graham Bell and Samuel F.B. Morse. Now, one could almost picture them in the corner of a big ballroom surrounded by the glittering jewels of the Gilded Age, while the inventors huddled together, smoking cigars and swirling brandy in oversized snifters, and talked shop about the latest high-tech advances like electric toasters and light bulbs, while trash-talking less successful but no less worthy or clever inventors like Nikola Tesla. Unfortunately for Almon, he never quite got into the 19th century cool nerds club. No. Almon was an old-fashioned bird in the hand worth two in the bush kind of guy, and in 1896 he sold his patents for the Switch for $1,800, and in 1898 he sold his share of the company for $10,000. He went back to the peace and quiet of being an undertaker, presumably having made his point, and to be totally fair, $11,800 at the turn of the 20th century was quite a bit of bank for the average Joe on the street. However, in 1916, those same patents alone were resold for a cool $2.5 million. So if $11,800 was a lot of money around 1900, then $2.5 million was an eye-watering, lip-smacking amount. Unfortunately, Almon wasn't at the dock when his ship came in. He had died a moderately wealthy man in 1902, and he had no idea just how much of a hornet's nest he had kicked over. The world had only begun seeing and understanding the impact his invention was having on every household, city, and nation around the globe. One could only wonder what he would think about telecommunications in the modern sense. As creative as he was, I doubt he could have imagined things as they eventually came to be, kind of like the old myth of Bill Gates saying that nobody would ever need more than 640K of computer memory. And that is Almon Strowger's story. He was determined to foil the supposed plans of one woman, and in so doing, he inadvertently wiped out an entire profession globally, fundamentally changed and streamlined how telephone calls are made around the world, and in fact set the telecommunications hardware standard that was replaced a full 7 decades after his death. Historians and biographers often agree that Almon was a man of great energy and determination, but also eccentric and irascible. They get paid to know things like that, but you don't need to be a grad student in psychology to know that they're onto something there. Thank you for watching. Cheers.